Victoria, Princess Royal. She was the first of nine, the eldest daughter of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, born in November of 1840, and in many ways, she was the child who inherited the most of her parents and benefited from it the least. Educated rigorously, fluent in multiple languages, trained as a painter, and possessed of a sharp political mind, Victoria the Princess Royal was in almost every sense prepared for greatness. Her father in particular saw in her an intellect worth cultivating, and by the time she was a teenager, she was already corresponding with statesmen and reading political philosophy that most princes of the era never touched. That greatness arrived in the form of her marriage to Frederick III of Germany, a union that promised to place a liberal, English-influenced empress at the heart of European power. It delivered nothing of the kind. The Prussian court she married into was suspicious of her from the start, viewing her English liberalism as a foreign contamination rather than a gift, and she spent decades quietly fighting a political culture that had no interest in what she believed. Frederick became Emperor of Germany in March of 1888, already dying of throat cancer. His voice reduced to a whisper communicated through notes. His reign lasted 99 days. When he died, their son Kaiser Wilhelm II took the throne and made it immediately clear that his English mother was not welcome in German politics. Wilhelm stripped her of influence, monitored her correspondence, and treated her with a contempt that historians have documented extensively in the letters she exchanged with Queen Victoria. Some of that hostility, biographers have suggested, was fed by German nationalists eager to discredit anything associated with England, and Wilhelm found it politically convenient to let his mother be cast as an outsider. She spent her final years at Friedrichshof, the estate she had built for herself, increasingly isolated. In the late 1890s, she developed spinal cancer, a condition causing her extraordinary pain, and she concealed the full severity of it from nearly everyone around her, reportedly in part because she did not wish to draw attention away from her aging mother. Even as her own body failed her, she continued writing letters to Queen Victoria, filled with detail about court affairs and family news, rarely mentioning her own suffering at all. Queen Victoria died in January of 1901. Victoria the Princess Royal died that August, 7 months later, aged 60, having carried her illness in near silence until the end. King Edward VII. The second child and the only son of Queen Victoria to outlive her and actually wear the crown, Edward spent so many decades as Prince of Wales that his reign as king lasted a mere 9 years, from 1901 until 1910, and yet he managed to leave a genuine diplomatic mark, earning him the nickname the Peacemaker for his role in strengthening European alliances. His state visit to France in 1903 is often credited with laying the groundwork for the Entente Cordiale, a diplomatic thaw that few observers thought the notoriously undisciplined prince capable of engineering. The decades before that, however, were a different story. Victoria blamed Edward, with very little rational basis, for the stress she believed contributed to Prince Albert's death in 1861, and she excluded him from meaningful royal duties for most of his adult life. He filled the void with remarkable dedication to pleasure. Horse racing, gambling, lavish dinners, and a series of well-documented affairs occupied his time, and the results were visible. His waist expanded to somewhere in the range of 48 inches, and he became one of the most recognizable physical silhouettes in Europe, a vast, bearded, cigar-smoking figure who ate 5 meals a day and refused to slow down. Contemporary caricaturists delighted in exaggerating his girth even further, and he took the mockery with more good humor than most royals of his standing would have managed. When he finally became king, he threw himself into the role with unexpected seriousness, but his body was not cooperating. By the spring of 1910, he was suffering from severe bronchitis, his lungs damaged by a lifetime of heavy smoking, and his heart was failing. He refused to rest. He reportedly collapsed while receiving visitors and regained consciousness long enough to be told that his horse had won a race at Kempton Park that day, which, depending on your perspective, is either a fitting final piece of good news or a deeply Edward VII sort of way to spend your last hours. He died on May 6, 1910, aged 68. Princess Alice, the third child of Queen Victoria, born in April of 1843. Alice possessed the same compassionate drive as her mother, but directed it outward with unusual practical force. During the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, she trained in nursing and worked directly with wounded soldiers, a hands-on commitment that set her apart from the ceremonial expectations of her position. She corresponded with Florence Nightingale about hospital reform and tried, with mixed success, to modernize the primitive medical facilities available to soldiers in Hesse. She had married into the House of Hesse and moved to Darmstadt in Germany, where she raised several children and maintained one of the closest and most emotionally honest correspondences with her mother of any of the siblings. Tragedy arrived in her household in layers. Her young son Friedrich Wilhelm, known to the family as Fritty, died in 1873 after falling from a window, and it was understood later, though not fully named at the time, that he had suffered from hemophilia and had bled internally in a way a healthy child would not have. Then, in the autumn of 1878, diphtheria swept through the family. One by one, her children fell ill, and her daughter May died. Alice was faced with the task of telling her surviving young son Ernst the truth. Medical guidance at the time urged strict quarantine and isolation to prevent further spread of the disease. Alice broke it. She told Ernst, and when the boy began to cry, she held him, because he was her son and he was grieving, and there was no version of herself that could have done otherwise. She contracted diphtheria from that embrace. She died on December the 14th, 1878, aged 35. That date was the 17th anniversary of the death of her father, Prince Albert. A coincidence so precise that it reads less like history and more like something a novelist would strike out for being too neat. Prince Alfred. The fourth child, born in August of 1844, Alfred built something his siblings rarely managed, a genuine professional career, independent of ceremonial obligation. He entered the Royal Navy as a young man and rose through the ranks on merit, eventually achieving the rank of Admiral of the Fleet, making him one of the most accomplished of Victoria's children in purely professional terms. His naval postings took him around the world, from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean, and he was widely regarded by his fellow officers as a genuinely capable seaman rather than a prince merely wearing the uniform. He survived an assassination attempt in 1868 while visiting Sydney, Australia, when a man shot him in the back during a picnic at Clontarf. The bullet lodged near his spine and he recovered, but the attack shook the family and briefly made Alfred famous across the empire, with hospitals and public buildings across Australia named in his honor during the outpouring of sympathy that followed. His later life was harder. His marriage to Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia was cold and conflicted, and Alfred drank heavily, a pattern that worsened as he aged. The true blow came in January of 1899, during the celebrations of his silver wedding anniversary in Coburg. His only son, Alfred Jr., shot himself. The young man survived the initial wound but died several days later. The family worked to suppress the details, but grief of that particular shape, losing a son to self-destruction while surrounded by celebration, does not suppress easily. Alfred's health collapsed in the months that followed. Throat cancer, likely worsened by decades of smoking and drinking, took hold. He died in July of 1900, aged 55, just 6 months after his son, and just 6 months before his mother. His death also carried an unusual dynastic consequence, since he had additionally held the title of Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, inherited from his uncle, and its passage afterward became tangled in questions of succession that reflected just how thoroughly Victoria's children had become woven into the ruling houses of continental Europe. Princess Helena. The fifth child, born in May of 1846, Helena led the quietest and in some ways the most useful life of Victoria's daughters, though history has remembered her less vividly than her sisters. She co-founded what became the Army Nursing Service and devoted substantial energy to healthcare administration and charitable causes, work that continued and expanded the compassionate legacy of her sister Alice. She also served for years as president of the Royal British Nurses Association, pushing for the professional registration of nurses at a time when the occupation had little formal structure. Her marriage to Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein was considered a modest match socially, arranged with the deliberate intention of keeping Helena close enough to England to remain near her mother, who depended on her considerably. The practical reality of her life, however, included a dependence on laudanum and opium-based medicines, common among upper-class women of the Victorian era as treatments for various ailments, rarely discussed openly, and in Helena's case, documented in biographical accounts without ever having been publicly acknowledged during her lifetime. She outlived her husband and spent her final years in increasing quiet. She died in June of 1923, aged 77, of natural causes at Schomberg House in London, making her one of the longer-lived of Victoria's 9 children and, perhaps fittingly for the least dramatic of them, the one whose death generated the least commentary. Princess Louise. The 6th child, born in March of 1848, Louise was the artist of the family in a way that was not decorative but genuinely accomplished. She studied sculpture seriously, training under professional instructors at a time when it was considered faintly improper for a princess to pursue art with such intensity. And the statue of Queen Victoria that stands outside Kensington Palace today is her work, which means that one of the most visited royal monuments in London was made by Victoria's own daughter. She was considered the most beautiful of the sisters, and among the most independent, openly frustrated by the constraints placed on royal women of her era, and she associated with artists and intellectuals in a way that scandalized more conservative members of the court. Her marriage to the Marquis of Lorne was by most accounts unhappy, and the persistent speculation that it was never a true marriage in any physical sense was widely circulated during her lifetime, and has been examined by historians since, without definitive resolution. They had no children. Louise outlived every one of her siblings by years. She died in December of 1939, aged 91, at Kensington Palace, having lived long enough to see 2 world wars, the end of the German and Russian empires her relatives had ruled, and the abdication crisis of 1936. She was the last surviving child of Queen Victoria, holding that position alone for the final years of her life. Prince Arthur. The 7th child, born May 1st of 1850, Arthur was Queen Victoria's favorite son, a preference she recorded plainly and without apparent embarrassment in her own writings. He was named after his godfather, the Duke of Wellington, and he took the military inheritance of that name seriously, building a career that included active service in the Fenian raids in Canada and the Anglo-Egyptian War of 1882, where he commanded troops at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir. His conduct there was regarded as competent and unflashy, much like the man himself, who avoided the scandals that trailed several of his brothers. He served as Governor-General of Canada from 1911 to 1916, one of the more substantive official roles held by any of Victoria's children, and he used the position to support Canadian involvement in the early years of the First World War. His personal losses accumulated in his final years. His wife died in 1917, and his son, Prince Arthur, died in 1938, following complications from an emergency appendectomy. Arthur himself lived on into the 1940s, dying in January of 1942 at Bagshot Park in Surrey, aged 91, during the Second World War, survived by almost none of the world he had been born into. He had watched the empire he served pass through Queen Victoria, King Edward, King George V, King Edward VIII, and finally King George VI, a span of monarchs that made him something like a living bridge between the Victorian world and the 20th century's Second Great War. Prince Leopold. The 8th child, born in April of 1853, Leopold was the son Queen Victoria watched most anxiously, and with reason. He had hemophilia, the hereditary bleeding disorder that Victoria carried and passed to several of her children and grandchildren, and which would eventually touch royal families across Europe in ways that reshaped history. Leopold bled internally from minor injuries that would have meant nothing to another person, and his mother's response was to restrict him, to protect him, to keep him close and still. Leopold refused the terms of that protection with considerable determination. He studied at Oxford, involved himself in royal administration, became one of his mother's private secretaries, and insisted on living as fully as his condition allowed, traveling more widely than his doctors advised, and reading voraciously in subjects ranging from constitutional law to music. He married Princess Helen of Waldeck and Pyrmont, had 2 children, and worried, according to his letters, about the likelihood of passing the condition to any sons. In March of 1884, while visiting Cannes in the south of France, he slipped on stairs at the Cercle Nautique Club and struck his knee. He was dead within hours, aged 30. killed by an internal hemorrhage that any other man would have walked away from. His daughter Alice would later carry the hemophilia gene into the Russian imperial family through her daughter Alexandra, who married Tsar Nicholas II. Their son Alexei suffered severely from the condition, and the desperate search for his treatment created the conditions in which Rasputin gained influence over the Romanovs. A stumble on a staircase in Cannes in 1884 connects, through Leopold's bloodline, to the collapse of Imperial Russia. Princess Beatrice. The ninth and youngest child of Queen Victoria, born in April of 1857, Beatrice was kept closer than any of the others, so close that when she announced at age 27 that she wished to marry Prince Henry of Battenberg, Queen Victoria refused to speak to her for 7 months, communicating with her only in writing, even though they lived under the same roof. The eventual compromise was that the couple would live with Victoria permanently, and Henry would give up his military career to remain at court, terms that Henry accepted and that shaped the rest of their lives. Beatrice served as her mother's constant companion, secretary, nurse, and emotional anchor for decades, the child who gave up the most of herself to fill the space left by Prince Albert. Henry, restless under the domestic arrangement he had agreed to, eventually pushed to join a military expedition to West Africa despite his wife's objections, and died there in 1896 of malaria contracted while on campaign, leaving Beatrice a widow at 38 with 4 children. She buried her grief in duty, as she always had. After Victoria's death in 1901, Beatrice was entrusted with her mother's extensive private journals, diaries spanning decades of the most consequential reign in British history. She spent the next roughly 30 years transcribing them in her own hand and then destroying the originals, editing as she went, removing passages she considered too personal or too revealing. Historians have not forgiven her for it, and probably never will, since no one will ever know precisely what was lost in the sections she chose to rewrite or omit entirely. In October of 1914, she lost her son Maurice at the Battle of Ypres, one of the earliest members of the royal family to die in the First World War. She died in October of 1944 at Brantridge Park in West Sussex, aged 87, the last echo of a world that had long since disappeared, holding in her memory things about her mother that she had decided, quietly and permanently, that no one else would ever know. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.